In your note there, in your bulletin there's a sheet of notes concerning our morning's message. I invite you to turn to the book of Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 3. We have been for some months looking at Ephesians chapter 2, where Paul tells us where we came from. Do you know your family tree or history? My own grandfather on my mom's side, so my mom's dad, was an orphan. We know almost nothing about that side of the family. The other side of the family we had traced back. We know some things. Apparently some heritage that goes back to Europe, maybe to Holland. At least the original name of my wife's family is from the Dutch, apparently. And so you can trace back, and maybe you know your heritage going way back. Again, only half of mine is known to some extent. That was the horse thief part, and the ones that people who ran from the law part of the family. That's my part, probably. Paul is desirous of our knowing where we came from. And we were from the pits. We were from the pits. It was hopeless. Things were bad. We were dead. And so in Ephesians 2, verse 1, he says, he used the word quicken. Actually appears later in this section of the chapter. God gave us new life and changed us from really being dead to giving us life. Praise be to his name. This despite the great enemy, Satan, in verse 2 mentions the prince of the power of the air, Satan, the devil. And despite that, because he is all-powerful, God, victorious, changed us. My verse 3 says, we all before had lives disproportionately, almost completely characterized by sin. And our manner of life, verse 3 says, well, it was according to our flesh. And we were busy checking off things and fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind. And verse 3 goes on and says, and we were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. This morning I direct your attention especially to verse 3. We had all of this in our past. We were not at all desirous towards God. We were successfully fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, but those were not appropriate desires to be fulfilling. There was frustration. There was horror and pain. And it was only death in our future. And then Paul adds in verse 3, we were by nature, he says, the children of disobedience. To what extent is that true? In our own minds, we like to say, that can't be me. That can't be some of the wonderful people I know in this fellowship. No! But the truth is, the Bible says that is the history of each and every one of us. And it is our cross. By nature, we are not friends with God. Some things come naturally, don't they? Some of those things are positive. Some of those things are quite negative. And the Bible says, either from before we entered into this world, or even as we entered in very early, we took upon ourselves that which was so horrible and in contradistinction to the holiness of God. We are sinners, the Bible says, because we're sinners, not just because we sin. Turn to an early site in the Scriptures as to sin and man's fall. Turn to Genesis. And how many, it'd be interesting to do a study. Maybe I could do a doctorate on this. Take a survey across the country over a period of time. How many men's preaching from the Bible begins in the book of Genesis on a Sunday morning? And very often ours does, doesn't it? Turn to Genesis chapter 5 and verse 3, and I challenge you, see if one of the things I say are in the Word. Genesis 5, verse 3. It says that Adam lived 130 years. That's enough to startle you right there, isn't it? 130 years? Wow. 130 years, though, and he begot a son in his own likeness, after his image. and called his name Seth, which immediately indicates where in the story this takes place. We know that this son, so important, of course, to Adam and Eve, was given to birth after the death of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel's story, a tragedy, horrible. Then God graciously provides for Adam a new son, for Eve and Adam a new son. Notice what it says. Who was he like? Was he like Eve? Was he like Adam? The Bible really doesn't give us distinctiveness in that direction. That's the favoritism, that kind of a favoritism. But here it says, he begot a son in his own likeness. That means from his loins, by way of Eve, he brought into this world, in Adam, a young man, a baby that would become the young man Seth. He had his own likeness. What does that mean? For instance, we know the Bible says that man has the image of God. We are in some way like God. But we do know this, don't we? That it's not talking about the famous Roman nose or certain hairline. It's not talking about all those things that we hold dear and distinctive and, of course, intimately ours. The Bible says God is a spirit. And they that worship him must worship him in what? Spirit and truth. Could that be one reason the Bible is so strong against idolatry, icons? Could that be one reason God takes affront when we're careless in this area? Because indeed, you want to worship me, says God. Well, I don't have any of those things. That's not me. I know you think it's to help you, but it's actually deceiving you in regards to me. No, likeness, in this case, image of God in this case, must have something else to do with God and his body. Could it be that when Adam was created, and when Eve was created, each of them began with a likeness to the very essence of who God is in so many ways. So many things of his character, not his body, but of his character and of his mind. All the excellencies of God know, but then they would be on. But what if in so many of the wonderful immaterial excellencies of God, Adam and Eve had those things and could be justifiably called the children of God, or the image of God, or made in the image of God? I believe that is getting closer to the truth. And when Seth was born, yes, even as Cain and Abel had been born, they had the same situation. But all of those births, those three births, happened what? Happened following sin. And so man still has so much of the image of God, but certainly we no longer quite have the holiness of God, do we? God, when he created man, gave unto man a likeness to himself and a part of his image. Whatever part of that image had to do with holiness certainly fell through the floor when sin occurred. And so the births of these three boys, Cain and Abel and Seth, and their descendants, there may be much that might seek out after God and appear, but there's no longer quite what Adam and Eve enjoyed before the fall as regards sin or lack of it. Holiness. Things change. You see that? Things change. Turn to the book of Genesis in my Bible, just a page over. Genesis 6 and verse 5. Here we have, of course, a big jump. This is to the account of the era of the ark. And we have here, of course, Noah. And God, observe this, know this, America, 2009, God knows what's going on. God is not ignorant. But even above the Jews, what did he notice of the beginnings of mankind? Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. And every imagination of the hearts of the thoughts of his heart was only evil, and that constantly, continually. It is noted here specifically, it didn't stop. There was little relief from it, no vacation from sin. It was continually before God, and man continually sinned with such evil. And of course we know God did something about that. May he have mercy on our own country. Now I look at Genesis chapter 8 and verse 21. Genesis chapter 8 and verse 21. We have here a verse regarding more Israel itself. Here we have God's people. Will he bless them? Can he bless them? What about their sin? Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor. An offering has been offered. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. God says, following the flood, I'm not going to do this again. He says, I'm not going to do this again. But you know the verse that I thought here at verse 21 that I don't recall ever knowing before. But looking at the middle of verse 21, we find out one of the reasons why God will never do the ark situation again. He will never destroy man to that extent. At the middle of verse 21, it says, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake. It says, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Man is so bad, says God. Man is so bad. And if I think God is saying, if I gave further similar punishment, I still wouldn't get the message even then. Now, our country suffered in September of 2001. All of us who lived here and remember that will always remember that, at that point especially, having been here at the point. Many of us thought, hey, maybe this is due us because of really unworthiness as a nation. Perhaps we've lost the blessing of God. Perhaps God is judging us. Still questions we cannot be clear as to what the answers are. But many of us thought, oh, the people will crowd the churches. People will get on their knees. You know, the Woodside Baptist, and as far as most churches that I know of, almost nobody reacted in a responsive way, really spiritually. I think we had one. I wouldn't be surprised if there was only one new person come the following week to our fellowship. And that person, maybe there was more, but I don't think any came extra from that event in the weeks to follow. You know, sometimes it just takes such a battering around our head, such a hurt, for us to finally understand or experience and turn to God. And I don't think people did. And if that's God's plan of action, look out, because there is still fulfillment to come. Could it be that we'll face something more? Could well be. And we would be just as worthy of it, just as due in our situation. But look at verse 21. It says, I don't think I'm going to do this anymore. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Unbelievable! When I was a boy, my sister, a year and a half younger than I, Carol, her name, she and I would end up sometimes being up at a country area, visiting an aunt and uncle who lived on a farm. This is a man I told you about over the years with the world's ugliest feet. He worked for 60 years milking cows. When you milk cows, you have to get close to a cow. And quite often those cows will step on your feet. A podiatrist's dream. My uncle, I can remember him soaking his feet. It was obvious on his face it was one of the joys of his life, maybe ours if we took it too. Soaking his feet. And I remember how ugly those feet were. Mom would take his feet. She was a single mom and had to work, but she wanted us to get away from home. So she took us to Uncle Roy and Aunt Mildred's. They had a garden. They lived in a postage stamp out in the Emerson Fields. They lived there for free at this wreck of a house for free because they worked on a farm. I remember how we cried, both my sister and I, every time Mom left us. And we felt it. And we wept. I have clearly forgotten what I was going to say. when I was a kid there, we were right next to fields with all sorts of cows. I remember my Uncle Roy going out to the fence near the barn, close to the barn, he'd call out, "Come on!" He'd call, "Come on!" And he'd be calling the cows from a distance, and his voice would carry a long ways, and those cows would come. They wanted to come, and they answered his call because they needed to be relieved of all the milk in their bags. And my uncle milked them.